everyone, welcome to our webinar on labels importer data training. I am going to do an audio and visual check first. So if you can hear me okay and you can see my screen, which should say labels importer data, please let me know utilizing that questions box. Thanks so much, and then we'll get started in just a few seconds here. All right, looks like we're good to go on the audio and visual front. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everyone, for being here today. All right, so let's go through introductions. My name is Ariadna. I'm not speaking right now. I am on our university success team. I've been at Handshake for a year and a half, which doesn't sound like a lot in comparison to higher education, but it is a lot in Handshake years. But before Handshake, I was actually a teacher. I taught first grade in the same school district that I attended as a child as part of Teach for America. So education is very near and dear to my heart. I love Handshake for its mission to help students find their next great opportunity. And that's why I love working every day here. I, of course, have not been here as long as my fabulous co-host today, which is Larry, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Ariadna. Yeah, so my name is Larry. I've been here about 4 years, or just made 4 years actually today. So been here for a little bit. In us grow, and it's been really exciting, and just love everything about the mission and everything like that. So I'll pass it over to Ariadna to get us going.
Awesome. All right, so a little quick agenda for us today. So first we'll review the different label types and uses. Then we'll go through some label management best practices. We'll talk about how to import different label types, core importer uses and best practices, data management, and then we'll end with questions. Of course, you can utilize that questions box throughout our presentation today. So if a question comes up, feel free to use that box and we'll go through those at the end.
Awesome, and I'll take it over from here. All right, so we're going to kind of go over label types and uses. So there are 3 main label types. We have system labels, normal labels, and public labels. System labels are labels that you can add to students' records through the Student Sync. It's only something that's available to do through the Sync. So it's something you can manage kind of more of an automated basis that ensures that students kind of meet what you have in your SIS or your database on your end. Normal labels, you can actually import those as well, but you can also manage them more in-app. This allows you to bulk add, bulk remove, everything directly from the application through bulk actions and stuff like that. These system labels and normal labels are actually both basically the same in a sense where they are only visible to career services. Students won't actually be able to see that on their end. And then the last label that we have is public labels. They are similar to normal labels as far as the management process of it. You can upload them in a labels file, but however, students will be able to actually see those. They'll see them on their account. So it's something you can, add. Maybe some schools will do it for like a work study or something that allows students to know that they qualify for something like that. We'll go to the next slide. Awesome. And so we'll kind of go over kind of the usage for each one of these. System labels are really great for things that you don't necessarily want, other career services users to actually update on their own. So it's something like they're connected to a specific career center, or they have a specific program that they are connected to. That way you can have that in available for you for reporting, but it's not something that can easily be removed from a student. So there's some more checks and balances there to do that. Normal labels are something that maybe you want to add when a students attend an event, or they participated in some program that you want to add on there, that just kind of for tracking purposes. Or like maybe a graduation group for a first destination survey, something you want to be able to easily put on and off as needed throughout. And then public labels, just kind of like I said before, those are going to be mainly for jobs, employer labels, so that students can actually see those, and then also ways for students to see like if they qualify for something like work study, for example. Go to the slide. And so label best practices. So really the big thing here is making sure that you use a standard naming convention for all your labels. For instance, you don't want to do, let's say, grad underscore year, and then the date, and then do a grad dash year. So, and then that date. Because what that'll do is you're gonna have two separate labels in there. It's gonna be harder to manage. So you definitely wanna make sure that you keep a standard practice for all your labels in app. That way the convention is the same, you don't have duplicates in there. You also wanna make sure that you add the roles properly to the users who should be able to manage those labels. That way you don't have people creating new labels that shouldn't be, if that's something that you really want to make sure you keep it very clean. So that's just one thing to think about. The other piece here that I have in the screenshot is specify what your labels can be used for. You can actually specify if it's only going to be used for a student, only going to be used for an employer. That really will kind of hamstring you a little bit, to where if you want to use that label later for, a student and an employer, it will make it harder to kind of adjust that. So I would actually suggest, or we actually suggest, leaving it as used for all. That way it can be connected to anything that you need along the way, without having any restrictions for you. And then also for usage of permission labels. So you can actually add permission labels to different things in apps. So for instance, interview schedules. If there's a program that you want your students to actually take before they're able to apply to an interview schedule, you can have them take a survey that will then attach it to their account, and then they will have permission to do that going forward. And then also reporting needs. So that's the last piece. It allows you to filter on these labels in your reporting. One thing to definitely note about that is it's also, if you're going to use it as a not label, it actually becomes a little bit harder to do. So it's definitely something to think about. So it's mainly if you want to identify students that qualify for a certain thing, so they have this label attached to their account, versus the other way around. It's just the way the reporting system works and how the kind of database lays everything out. You definitely want to use it more to identify those students that have the label versus the students that do not have the label. So, and then we'll talk about importing system labels in your user file. So this is a very unique process where you would add it to your student sync. It's going to have its own header, system underscore label underscore names. Very important that you make sure that it says names. If you just do name, it will reject out and will not actually add those as intended. You can have as many labels as you want under that, for that student. They would just need to be separated out by a semicolon. One thing to note about system labels is that when you do it in a student sync, it's going to update that student to match whatever is in the sync. So for example, if a student has label 1 and label 2 on their account, and then you have an import that says label 2 and label 3, it will remove label 1 from that student and they will only have label 2 and label 3. So it's going to literally take whatever's in the file and update the student to match that. So it's a very important piece to remember when you are adding them in there. You want to make sure that the labels that they have are always included in the sync. Otherwise, you could have some that are missing. So it's very important to remember that. You can also, we have a nice little support article, how to change system labels to normal labels, if that is something you need to do down the road, since system labels can only be uploaded to, only be added to a student's account in a student sync. So maybe later down the road, you want to manage it outside of that. Awesome. And so then we're talking about importing normal labels. So normal labels, it is a very easy process. It's a pretty simple import. The one thing to definitely note on this is that you want to make sure you have a separate line for each label that needs to attach to whatever that identifiable that you're using, whether it's a user, whether it's a contact or anything like that. So if you need to add 2 labels to them, there will need to be 2 rows for each one of those identifiables. And then the other thing to note, normal labels can be added or removed in-app. Like I said, you can do it per student or item. You can also use bulk actions. And then of course you can also add or remove them in-app in the school settings as well. It doesn't have to just happen in your sync. It will automatically create them if it's in the label file. So it's definitely something to note there. And then, as it says here, normal labels cannot be used as system labels, and that's kind of where that article that I referenced just a slide above is how to change that afterwards. And then you can only have up to 10 unique labels per import file. So anything over that, the system will, or the importer will reject that file and not update it. So definitely something to note when you're doing that. All right, and so now we'll talk about the import best practices, use of best practices, things you can do in the importer. You can update, overwrite student data. You can fix incorrect records. A very useful tool is you can clear out most of the student records. There are a few that can't, just because they are, usually it's actually the 2 that aren't, you can't, are sensitive fields, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you use asterisk, asterisk, all caps, clear, asterisk, asterisk in those fields, it will delete that record on that student's account. One big thing for that we'll talk about later is when you are having a returning student. You need to clear out their end date because they have a new start date for their masters or whatever. You'll get an error that one's a the new start date is in the future, so you definitely want to clear out that end date, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this. You can also disable archive inactive students. So we don't actually delete. You don't really want to delete because you still want their record for when they had contact with your career services. That way you can keep record of your activity at your career center. So we definitely you can archive those students in there. Things you can't import. You cannot import exclude from automatic syncs. The big reason for that is we want to make sure that that's not an easy thing to add, because we want to be very intentional when we remove student from syncs. We don't want their data to be stale. We don't want it to be incorrect for things like jobs, qualifications. So it's a very important piece. So it's very intentional to make it to where you actually have to go in app and update that. And then fields not specifically listed in the importer, so custom fields. So that is, you can't add fields into the importer that aren't actually available. We actually suggest using system labels to do stuff like that. That way you can easily be able to search for those in app. You also cannot update students that have a .edu that's not associated with your school. So if a student is using an email address from a different school that is not connected, or email address is not connected to your school specific email domain, it will not allow you to update them in the importer. That will have to be done manually for that student, or you will want to update them to your school specific email. Things you can't undo update via the import. You can't update notes. So once they're uploaded, they will have to be manually removed or edited. It's a create only type thing. Labels import is another one. You would have to do in-app using the bulk actions or directly on that student's account. Or whatever that thing that the label is attached to, and appointments. So appointments is a create only as well. You can't do any sort of edit to an appointment that has been that is currently present in the system. And creating users, you can't delete users in the import. You can only update and then obviously archive them. Awesome. So we're in student imports, recommended required fields. So all the required fields, we've updated this recently. So the ones that we have now that are required are email address, username, auth identifier, which is used for single sign-on, first name, school year, cumulative GPA, major, and degree level or education level. So those are the required fields. We definitely strongly recommend adding card ID if you are using the kiosk. Because without that, I shouldn't say kiosk, if you are allowing students to check in using their cards. So if that's something you are doing, you definitely want to include that to ensure that the kiosk will work for those students. And then of those required fields, 2 of them are sensitive fields that we will talk about very shortly, which is username and the auth ID, or in the actual student sync, it's called the auth identifier. Perfect, and now we're actually talking about sensitive fields. So our 2 sensitive fields are username and auth identifier. The reason these are sensitive is because the username is actually used for the anchor when we're talking about importing students. So it's actually used in combination with email address. It's ensuring that we are updating the correct student's account. So when we're talking about username, we definitely want to make sure that it's a piece that doesn't get updated for students very often, so it cannot change for the most part. That ensures that when the import is doing its thing, it's connecting with the right student and doesn't actually create duplicates. So that's a big thing. So anytime that gets updated, it will require a couple extra steps. The other one is auth identifier. And the real reason for that one is that one's actually connected to single sign-on. So when we're talking about students logging in, we want to make sure that once they've authenticated on your end through your server, when they're bounced back to Handshake, when we're looking their account up, we find the correct account and show them the correct information. So those are those 2 sensitive fields. And right now, we no longer have the option of updating it. I should have removed it from the slide here. I do apologize, of updating it through AWS. So that is no longer an option to do the opt-in for trust sensitive fields. You can only do this through a manual import. And the main reason for that is we want to make sure that it's very deliberate when either one of these are updated. We used to have more sensitive fields. For example, email address was one of them, card ID was one of them. We removed that so that way it's only those 2 specific fields, and that way there aren't as many not many times that you're going to have to do this kind of this manual update. So when you are doing the manual update, you will want to select this job change identifier data option when you're creating the job. This will ensure that next time when it actually goes in, it will update those fields. All right, and then we have common fixes. So we have duplicate accounts. We can't delete in bulk. So a lot of times what will happen is a student will register for an account using maybe they try to log in using an email address that isn't currently in this. Maybe they have 2 email addresses. So they go in, they use the incorrect one, they create this account, and now the student has duplicates. So this is something that you will definitely want to make sure that you delete that account when they're in their pending status, when they're in your waiting for approval. So you can delete those accounts, and then when you do your next upload, you will be able to change it that way. You don't have the issue. The easiest way to tell that it's been manually created is in this example, you'll see it has the email address and username match. The reason being is when a student goes in to manually create their account, whatever email address they use is automatically added to their username. The other thing that you'll be able to use to identify it is their auth identifier will be blank. Students are unable to update the username and the auth identifier. So if you see that, if you see username matching the email address and the auth identifier is blank, that means that account was manually created. So you definitely want to delete that account and then go ahead and update the new, run your sync again to update it to have the correct information. Date formatting errors is another one. You are able to change this to where you can use the month, day, day, year, but that's only for manual imports. So a lot of times you'll see that Excel, even though you have it coming in as the correct format when you created it, Excel will sometimes strip that formatting and change it to the month, day, day, year option. So you definitely want to go in, select the option to use that format if that's what you want to do. However, for automatic syncs that you create directly through your SIS and send it through to AWS, it has to be in the year, month, day format. And then we have the invalid or test data was actually accidentally imported. You'll just want to import another file, clear out all the fields, and then make sure that you update a new one or upload a new one with all the correct information. Another thing to note about tests, if the job or the file has the word test or sample in the file name, the importer will automatically mark that as a test file. So that file will never be able to be run. So just ensure that that's always out when you are updating uploading your files. There's more here. Canimport.edu email addresses. We talked about that as well, how to handle those. You can disable archive accounts via the import, but you cannot delete. Clear is the same thing. To clear those things out, the main one here, just as this example, is the primary education end date. This is a very common one that you'll see. You'll see an error that says the end date or the start date is in the future. And that means basically that start date is happening after or in the future compared to the end date. So that end date needs to be cleared out. And then when you run that same file, it will totally work and pass that through. Another big one that we see is mobile number. So the mobile number has to be 10 digits, exactly 10 digits. So no dashes, nothing else. If it is incorrect, that row will error out and it will not update. So it's very important that you make sure that it's always 10 digits in that field. And then sensitive fields will not automatically update by default as well. All right, a few other ones here. We have, so we have two different kind of analyzers when you talk about an import. The first analyzer is when a file is first uploaded into the importer. That analysis will actually compare the current file to the previous file, the last file that was received where that student was in it, and it will also make sure that all the formatting is correct. When you're talking about red, that's going to be any error that you have to make sure that you fix. Yellow is more of a warning. Sometimes that's, we all want to see all the green or the color that says everything's good, but warnings are just something that you just want to just kind of review, make sure that it's expected, and go with that. When we're also talking about the analyzer, just to kind of go a little bit off topic somewhat, when rows will get skipped if they were present in the last successful import. So if a student's data matches exactly what it was in the last import received, where that student was in it, it will skip that record. And that's just to ensure that the importer is processing with no issues, not even processing with no issues, that it's as efficient as possible. So it's just something that we do to help with that. And then post-run errors. Now this is actually comparing the student data that's in Handshake compared to what's in the file. And that's where you'll actually want to go in, to the actual import, click on View, Download Results, and then click the Download Failed Rows CSV. This is all formatted to where it includes the response of why it failed, and you can actually use this same file to upload to fix these. So maybe it's, most of the time it's a sensitive field, you can just upload that as is and run it, selecting that sensitive fields option, and it'll fix most of your errors. That's usually kind of the first step that I would suggest doing when you do it. That way it kind of makes it a little bit easier to look at it. So if you have 150 rows of errors, instead of trying to go through each individual one, run it really quickly using the sensitive fields option if you know that everything is correct in that file, and then look at the remaining errors to fix those, because usually by that point you'll have a much smaller list and it'll be much easier to manage from there. Awesome. And now we're talking about data management. So now we're talking about our senior to alumni transition, a very important piece. Students who leave your university, and then auditing your system. Perfect. So now when we're talking about transitioning students to alumni, this is not an automatic process and will need to happen in your import. So it's something you will want to make sure that you either do a separate file or have that in kind of included in your regular automated sync. It really depends on how you can actually do that with your actual SIS. Some people have the ability to include it towards the end of the semester. Some will actually have to do a separate file. We definitely suggest doing it at the end of each semester to ensure that you have accurate data in there as far as who's an alumni and who's an active student. So it's really a very important piece to ensure that your data is correct at all times. And this also allows you to easily update this later down the road if they do return. Having them as an alumni makes sure that their record's still in Handshake, and you can update that at a different time. We've kind of talked about some of these other things a little bit earlier about email address. You can change it, would have to be a manual process that the student would have to confirm that change. You can also go to a personal email address. Those can totally be done in an import, so there's no issues with that. And that way you can also continue to collect data on your surveys in FDS. And then for students that leave your school, we usually see this happening kind of in the same cadence as the other ones. So you'll see, like, at the end of each semester, you'll get a file of all the students that left. You will then archive those students, and you just set the disabled column, you add disabled, and then mark them all as true. Then, of course, at the end, so if a student does come back, it's a very simple fix of just marking them as false. The next time they may error out. Actually, they will not error out, but if they do come back, you can include that in maybe your, at the beginning of each semester, where everyone's automatically marked as false in your file. So that was an easy way to make sure that whoever's in the file is always going to have an active account. And then auditing your system. So we definitely suggest that you audit your system to make sure that everything is updated on a regular basis, at least once a year. So the best way to do that is to run a report in Handshake that will, in Insights, that compares the numbers of each class, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, compared to what your enrollment numbers are. That's kind of the first thing to do to ensure that everything is looking good. If things don't match, what you'll do is use that same report. You want to add the students to it at that point. And then from there, you can compare that file to what you're actually uploading into the importer. Usually what I do is I will use the email addresses and then look for duplicates in there, and then get rid of the duplicates and just look at the ones that didn't have one in both, that wasn't present in both. That way I can easily kind of narrow it down to then start looking at those students to see what's happening with those. All right, well, that's our webinar on the importer and labels, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm gonna go look in here.
So it looks like the first question is from Christy, who is asking, do we have to import all those fields just for labels?
Just for labels. So when we're talking about labels, I'm assuming you're just talking about a regular labels up import. There are some that are required. It's in the Help Center documentation. It doesn't have to be, let me just get it out here. I should know it by heart, but I don't. Let's see here. The required ones, you definitely have to have the identifier. The identifier is going to be the email address if you're talking about a student. Um, and then you also want the identifiable type. So it's going to be user, contact, or employer. For employer, the identifier is going to be the ID. So the ID you can find at the end of the URL, or you can run a report in Insights where you actually, under the employer section, you'll see an ID field that you can actually pull it from there. So that's a little bit easier to do. But you will need the identifier, which is either the email address for the contact or user, the employer ID if you're doing employer. Then the three identifiable types are user, contact, or employer. You will need user type if you are doing students, or if you're doing a user, option, and that's going to be students, mentors, or career services. So you can definitely add it there. And then name. Name is the actual label that you're, the name of the actual label. Those are the only required ones. So you do need those pieces though to do that. We're running through the questions right now here.
Yeah, so the next question is from Ron. What is the best practice if the system of record has an incorrect GPA for a student? Do they have to change the GPA every day after the import? They might need the correct GPA to apply for a job.
Great question. So if I'm understanding correctly, is the system doesn't have, has the incorrect GPA. So that's where the actual first analysis comes into play there. So if you have an import and that student, so you import that data for the student, and then they have to go in and change their GPA. If the record remains the same for that student, it will actually not update what they have in Handshake. So for the most part, what we'll see is that will remain the same until your system of record gets updated. Then what it'll do is when it does get updated with that GPA, it will go in and try to update it because it doesn't actually look to see if it's the same in-app. But once that record changes in the file compared to the last one, it will automatically go in and try to update it, which by that time, most likely the system is already correct because the student has updated it.
So Ron's follow-up question to that is, so import compares import to import, not import to current values. Is that right?
Correct, yes. In the initial analysis, correct. So when we're going to determine whether a student's either going to be updated or skipped, we will actually look based on the last file received for that student, correct.
The next question is, currently our school will wait until the end of the add drop period to import new students. Is this typically a best practice?
That's a great question. I don't think we have a best practice on that, to be honest with you. It's really what works best for your school. As long as the information gets updated and you're sending that in regularly, it shouldn't be an issue either way.
All right, looks like those are all the questions that have come in so far. Feel free to drop one or two more in while you have us on the line. There is a question about if there will be a recording on this webinar, yes, we typically do record all of our webinars and then we post them on the same page. So the same page where you go to register for all of your webinars, you will find lots of recordings. And so this one will go up there, hopefully by the end of next week. So we'll stay on the line for just about 1 or 2 more minutes, and if there are no further questions, then we'll end the webinar here. So it looks like we're all set. Thank you all so much for your time today, and reach out to our support team if there are any follow-up questions. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.